Vaccines are a life-saving medical miracle of the last 75 years, but they come at a price that is often significant burden to independent pediatric practices. Luckily, our friends at Practice Well, a not-for-profit community of and for pediatricians, are dedicated to helping pediatricians do the right thing and vaccinate children. That is why they have provided a generous corporate sponsorship for today's show. Please visit practicewell.org, 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 or click on the link on the show notes. You can join for free, and if you mention the Pediatric Lounge, they will set up a free consultation on your vaccine serum acquisition. Hello, George. It's Tuesday morning, and we got a great guest today, one of my really dear friends and another data nerd, Chip Hart. We're
Yeah.
talking about no-shows, short-term capital, and autonomy.
Yeah. Today's going to be a great day. This is a follow-up with Chip, and Chip is always a great podcast when we hear his knowledge.
Welcome, Chip.
Yeah, no pressure. I'll do my best.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. You guys are going to be really the first people I've spoken to today, except, my dog and my wife briefly. So we'll see. Well, you got to warm up my brain, and I see that you've got some pretty expansive topics to talk about. So this is going to be fun. Let's see what we come up with.
Well, I was fascinated, and we had this conversation. When did you write the blog on no-shows? I think it was maybe 18 months or 2 years ago.
Well, it was pre-COVID, so you got to add like 2 or 3 years to everything.
Okay.
Yeah. But it wasn't long before COVID. That work that we did on no-shows, I ended up presenting at the, what's it called? The Predictive Analytics World Conference in Las Vegas, of all places. They have a healthcare segment, most of which is dedicated to how to predict that your senior patients are going to come back into the hospital. I mean, seriously, that's like what everyone cares about is Medicare. And so when I gave a pediatric presentation, it was kind of exciting. And we'd engage a company called Rexer Analytics out of Cambridge. They're great, awesome people because we have at PCC, we have millions and millions of appointments as part of our data set. And I was really interested in digging into some of the science and some of the behavioral patterns that exist in no-shows because I hear a lot of myths. I hear a lot of storytelling. You know this, you practice. If I said, George Rogu, when do your patients no-show? And you'd be like, oh, Friday afternoons, like they always bail. And I wondered if that were true, because if it's true, if you know that your patients no-show on Mondays and Fridays more often, or if they no-show more during the summertime or whatever, or the winter, everyone's pattern's different. If we knew those patterns existed, we could change our practice behavior. And what we found was that, for example, there is no difference with no-show rates Monday through Friday. There's no difference. They don't no-show more or less on Mondays or Fridays. They don't show more or less at different times of year. What they do.
So I'm going to interrupt you
because you said, please.
You've said a couple of things that are very interesting from the data nerd perspective. Mm-hmm. One, what is predictive analytics? Is that like forecasting the weather?
Well, yes, but really predictive analytics is, you've heard these terms. It's AI, it's machine learning, and it's using data, past data, to predict the future. And it's used mostly, in my opinion, in the advertising and financial services arena. So when you get a credit score, or when you apply for a mortgage or a car loan, if you are walking by, if you get an ad served to you by Google, they're using all of this data to determine what ads to put in front of you because they know that this ad is the most likely for you to click on at that moment. They know that you're the least likely to default on this loan, let's say. In medicine, as you know, most of the analysis is rear view mirror stuff, like what happened last week, what happened last month, how did we perform, what was our E&M curve. And it's very rare that we use medicine in pediatrics anyway. Like I've talked to you guys plenty about numbers and dashboards and stuff like that. And there isn't a lot of analysis in our business for us to say, we know what your revenue per visit has been the last 3 months. Let's predict what it will be. how about, and this was where my dream was headed, and COVID came up and other things happened, but I want to be able to predict because I think we have enough data. I want to be able to look at a pediatric practice. Like, I want to waltz into RBK Pediatrics and say, George, here's how much cash flow you can expect to get over the next 3 months because these appointments are booked. This is what the sick demand looks like right now. This is what your collection rates look like. We should be able to predict that. And the starting point of that is predicting no-shows or predicting what your schedule is going to look like. You have no idea. You can't predict your revenue if you don't know how many patients are going to come in. Of course, COVID blew that up. We'll see where it's going, but that's what predictive analytics means. Using the data you have now to predict the future. And most of the time in medicine, we predict the past. We describe the past.
Chip, I have a question for you. You mentioned revenue per encounter. This is a question that I have with Herb. How do you calculate that?
So there's no right way to do it. There's no accepted methodology. I can tell you what I do because I work at PCC and PCC's wired a certain way and it's a way I think. And so all my benchmarks are sort of aligned in my head that way. It's not necessarily the best way or right way to do it, but there is no clear right way or that's what we would do. So the easiest thing to do, and I suggest this method because it's generally the easiest thing to do.
Okay.
We add up all the revenue you received, including your value-based care revenue, including your performance revenue. You throw that all in one bucket.
There. Okay.
You put all that in there because it's part of what you were paid one way or the other. All right. And then you add up all the visits you had, all of them. And that's your denominator.
What is the definition of visit? So if somebody comes in for a strep test, is a strep test a visit?
We count that, yes. All right. Now, there are pros and cons to that. There are pros and cons to that. Now, the big pro is that, if you leverage the law of averages and you presume that behavior's somewhat, regresses to the mean over time, it's a consistent, as long as you're using the number for yourself consistently, it shouldn't matter. However, one of the reasons why lumping all of that together is important, if you take a look at what happened during COVID, there was a massive increase in COVID test only and COVID shot only visits in practices, massive. And if you, in order to calculate that number for your practice, if you're only adding up E&M visits like sicks and wells and consults, the things that you label a visit, suddenly about 20% of your revenue and your schedule was being eaten up by this other thing, this little non-visit tumor, let's call it. And your revenue per visit could have looked good, but your revenue wasn't as high because you had to make room for all these extra visits. So I like, broadly speaking, to count every visit, including those strep tests and everything like that. And this is the kicker.
The vaccines.
For the cool kids, you actually break out your revenue per visit by visit type. So you really want to know, how much am I getting for well visits? How much am I getting for sick visits? How much am I getting for what we'll call them like other types of visits? Those are telemedicine E&Ms. Those are consults. Those are in-hospital visits. They're much smaller. It's a very small segment of your, it's less than 10% of your.
So before we go down deep into the weeds.
Yeah.
Because George and I have this constant argument. He thinks that revenue per visit means I take all the revenue you get into a practice and then I divide it by all the CPT codes that I have for the year.
Oh, not all the codes, all the office visits or physical visits.
No. You say everything. Everything.
Oh, you put everything into it. So the strep test, the COVID test, the vaccines, the admins.
All in your revenue. I'm just saying, what do you divide it by? If you divide it by everything that you did, every CPT code you did, you're going to get a number probably in the 30s or 40s per CPT,
Actually, it's funny because it includes immunization. Yeah, it'll be in the 30s, but you're right. So what I would tell you is, no, I wouldn't divide it by all your CPT codes, obviously. I think George is shooting for all your E&Ms. Either whether you count up what you would call a full visit, E&M, sick and well, those others, or you count all the appearances of a kid in your office that day, which is what we count at PCC. the most important thing, either method misses something. So if you use what I'll call the PCC method, which is to count every appearance of the kids in your office, as you're benchmarking yourself, remain consistent and use that benchmark, but then go the second step, which is to actually break it down by visit type. If you're only doing it for the chunk of E&M counters that you do, you might want to pull out all the revenue you get from those COVID only tests and COVID shots and strep tests, because then that revenue, if you don't, you're counting revenue for a visit where the visit also isn't in the denominator. And so you got to pick
and
one.
you're pulling out this data, then you're pulling it out from the schedule, not from you're counting how many people are scheduled. I mean, how do you pull
So
it?
that's a good nerdy question. And what I'll tell you is PCC doesn't pull it out of the schedule because we're able to actually look at the charges and say, all right, we can calculate visits from the charges, because there is, in fact, at every single practice I've ever worked with, a difference between what's in the schedule and what gets billed, for good reason. It's not like mistakes are made, but even though that does happen, it's more like sometimes you charge things they weren't in the schedule. Sometimes a doctor does something and they didn't put it in the schedule. That happens for the people who still go to the hospital, for example, or a lot of telemed stuff, especially at night. That stuff doesn't show up. And also there are plenty of visits, too many visits, that get scheduled and the patient doesn't show, but they're not marked as canceled, as missed, or if there's a 0-minute appointment made for some purpose as a mark. It's crazy what people do. And so what we do is we back out and say, all right, we're going to look at everyone who got billed out today, and on any single day, any single appearance of a patient we will consider to be a visit. It's not perfect, but it's consistent. And then if we go the second step of breaking it down by visit type, where we actually say, all right, look for a 99391. Everything that happened that day, we're going to count as a 391. And what does that 99391 visit look like? I think that's the only way you can do it.
What about the vaccine serums? Where does that get put?
So personally, I count all the products. All right. And I realize that that's also imperfect. All right.
Yeah.
That's why, I mean, George, you may remember this from your dashboard days of PCC. That's why we have a revenue per visit with and without vaccines, because as a business owner, you have to include the vaccines. It's, for most of you, it's 25% of your revenue. All right. You have to include it. It would be weird not to make that part of your analysis. And you should be understanding whether or not you are profitable or losing money on the product. However, if you want to benchmark your performance against the rest of the country, where you have people in 90% Medicaid, you have people who live in universal states, you have to exclude the vaccine for all the other performance, because the vaccines absolutely sort of overwhelm or push out the ability for you to do the analysis. The other thing I'd add is that issue's only getting bigger, not smaller. 20 years ago, I never even thought about whether or not to include vaccines in the revenue, because it was 10%. And 10%'s a lot, but it's not like, it's not like it was a huge distinction among the practices. Just 10%, maybe even less sometimes. But now it's like 28 to 32%, 25 to 32%. And that wrecks all the numbers.
I gotta keep interrupting you because I'm a data nerd.
Please.
But when you say 28 to 30%, you're talking about a practice that's mostly commercial. Because if you start talking about a practice that's 85% Medicaid, they're not, they're
correct. You're totally correct. However, let me say this.
You get to, remember, 50% of the kids in any given state in America are now on Medicaid. So a large practice that takes everybody is going to have 50, 60% Medicaid. They're not going to have 30% of vaccines. So the difference between
I will give you the real numbers, though.
Okay.
All right. So here's the thing. About 30% of PCC clients' volume is Medicaid.
Okay.
Right? And now, just as an aside, when someone says, I'm 30% Medicaid, you always have to say, is that dollars, is that visits, or is that patients? Okay. Right. And for us, it's 30% of their patients. All right. Okay. I'm off the top of my head, I can't tell you if that's 38% volume or 25% volume, but it's about 30% of volume by patient, active patient count. Okay. We obviously have clients who are at 95 and 100%. We have 12% of our clients are at 0%. Yes, 55% of the children in the United States right now are on Medicaid. However, a huge chunk of those kids do not have pediatricians, do not see pediatricians, or do not go to an independent practice. Huge chunk. They go to RHCs and FQHCs, and they see FPs and internists, and I mean, like, all that stuff is true. So our clients see 30% Medicaid, even with across all of our clients. Okay, even with that 30% Medicaid volume, and we have plenty of practices in universal states, all right, which is the same thing. I believe vaccine product is in 2022 was about 23%. I am saying this off the top of my head, but it was about 23% of all the revenue our clients received.
I'm going to circle back to this
Yep.
because this is another, so we have somebody who listens to us in California, and she's phenomenal, Sabrina. And she says, you and George, the car talk of pediatrics. You remember that show on NPR? And
I remember it very well.
I love that car show. This is my Saturday to go show. And George and I argue a lot about the numbers because I don't think he understands math. But
Nice guy.
But he's willing to argue with you.
But he's willing to argue with me, okay?
Yep.
But what is important in parsing all this out? Why? Why do we collect data? Why do we build dashboards? I mean, why? Because it entertains me? Because I like math better than dealing with people?
Yeah.
Well, there could be an element of that. All right. I give a big dashboard talk. I tell people the same thing every time, and it usually clues them in. Would you treat a sick kid without taking a temp and a pulse and a blood pressure and some labs?
No.
Of course not. I mean, you can. And there are times when, most of the time you'd be rightish. Think of all the data you collect as a doctor, which is a form of a scientist. All right. The scientific method is arguably the single most important thing human beings have developed, in my opinion. And when you have a hypothesis, you can't prove it with your feelings. All right. And I am gainfully employed, and you guys are like, now in the business, you will be gainfully employed because too many doctors use their feelings about how their practice works instead of the facts. The numbers are the fact. And you can tell me all day long that you have 100% vaccination rate in your practice and you never miss a kid. But until you show me the receipts, doesn't mean anything. Well, saying, let's look at the numbers.
You are correct on that.
95% of the time. Yeah,
Herb
go
is
ahead, sir.
correct also with the dashboards, but in my experience with both of you guys, my feelings were pretty darn close to your numbers. But the numbers are more important. I agree with you. So you're supposed to use the numbers not as absolutes, as a warning, there's a problem.
Warning and proof.
See if your feelings are
so there's
correct.
the point. So, okay, I have an even sillier explanation back to the car talk show. There's a reason why my cars, which are all Mercedes and they're all gasoline driven, have a gas tank gauge. It's because I don't want to run out of gas on the highway because there's no way of knowing how much gasoline is in my tank. So when that little yellow light turns on, it means I got to stop now and put gasoline in my car. If you're not going to use the data that CHIT provides or that we provide or that whomever provides for you to make decisions and change your behavior, let's not waste time.
You are correct. So that's
Keep doing what you're doing, and let's not waste time.
Even that discussion we had with that student.
Yes.
It says a dashboard is there for you to analyze, to figure out stuff, and then you have to act on it.
If you're not take action when your gas gauge says it's in yellow, well, then just yank that thing out and drive until you get run out of gas. And then
all right, I'll say two things. I'll say two things about this. Number one, George, you're right. I mean, the overwhelming majority of independent practices survive because they I'm making payroll. I feel like I'm making okay money. I know I can make a little bit more, but so it's not like most of the time the pediatricians are really far off. But I guarantee every practice I've ever worked with, including yours,
Yeah,
you have your finger on a couple things, but there's always something you're not feeling and you're not seeing. And that's
I
why
agree
I
with
like
you.
sort of it's like getting a panel, okay? You like ding 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 ding. Oh, the PSA is too high. I had no idea. Like you wouldn't know unless you did it. But
Yeah.
here's the other thing.
So, but speaking of
Even
the
yeah,
PSA being high doesn't mean you have cancer. It means
correct.
take a look, analyze, figure out what the problem is,
One totally
resolve it.
totally true.
Right.
All
Yeah.
right, number 2 though, even lowly pediatrics, and I'm like lowly pediatrics that we all in the specialty that gets the least amount of money. I think it was Bloomberg just released their latest numbers, or whomever it was, just released their latest numbers. Even pediatrics has so much cash flow that your margin of error as a business owner is so big that you can make mistakes the whole way through. The number of, I mean, literally $1 million mistakes that I have unearthed at pediatric practices, individual pediatric practices, and they
Mhm.
just cruise along. It just means they didn't, over a course of 10 years, this poor doctor made, 1.5 million instead of 2 or 3 million like they deserved. Well, over 10 years back in the 2000s, 1.5 million, you're still in the 1%. You're still sending your kids to college. You still have a mortgage. There's so much cash that flows through that even the people whose feelings aren't good or aren't accurate still survive. I think if you had a lower cash flow business, you would be more attuned to your numbers. That's
I
my
agree.
experience.
And to me, it just, and I think you have a lot more experience than I do. I've seen ophthalmologists, orthopedic surgeons, radiologists, pediatricians, and you walk in and they all have the same common problem: revenue cycle management.
It's a
They
big
they
one.
don't know how to do that, and it's exactly what you said. You look in there, depending on the size of the practice, there's millions of dollars lost. They're just sitting there. Nobody ever worked elections. Nobody ever appealed. Nobody had a flag to raise so that the managing partner could know there's a problem. And but they're making plenty of money. So they're like, okay, well, my life is good. Why should I have another headache? And
Yep.
the insurance company love it. It's like,
Yeah.
keep
They're
leaving
making
that
money
money.
every day.
Keep leaving that money in my pocket. I don't care.
Yeah. It's organized crime, or it's like organized crime.
Like organized crime.
Yes.
Organized crime.
Anyhow.
It's the only business where you make more money if you're bad at your job. Oh, we forgot to pay you.
Oh, last
Oh,
time I said that, you yelled at me.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, or no, it's like the insurance companies. Oh, we made a mistake and we shouldn't have denied those claims, or we should have paid you. Oh, our bad.
Yeah.
There's no actual repercussion for them doing their job poorly, except for they make more money on the float.
Okay. So here's another click and clack argument.
All
We
right.
ran some numbers with our coaching group, right? And the
Yep.
difference right now, there's a lot of confounding factors, but they're super performers. So they're getting on the average about $150 per revenue per
Per
encounter
visit.
per
Yep.
visit. And if you add the vaccines, they're getting 153. That's a little bit more than what you say your
You're saying
benchmark.
that you're saying it's a 4.5% difference. So you must have practices with a lot of Medicaid and/or are in
No, they
universal.
they have
But
they have anywhere between 40 to 60% Medicaid. So their vaccine revenue is only 10% of what they collect. So
okay,
they're different practices, but the differential there is not a lot, but they're doing great. I mean, your KPI is of 140 for the average practice per visit. So they're above the national average. Now that's all funny business too, right? Because we've been testing for a lot of COVID that gets reimbursed very well. And that's going to go away. So that
well,
number
are you
drops.
counting every visit to the practice, or are you counting just the E&Ms?
They're not on PCC, Chip. So I have to do what I can do. So I count all the NMs as a
Right, which is fine. No, that's a perfectly
as a
reasonable way to do
as
it.
a
But then
denominator.
I would not then compare them to us, because right now the non-E&M visits are in some cases 25% of the volume of a practice. So
So are there
comparing,
still people that go just for COVID test?
oh yeah,
We don't do
oh
that.
yeah.
Yeah, we don't have many people doing
We
that.
don't have that anymore. We
Yeah, we
everybody's
actually,
in for a visit, and in that
yeah,
visit, you do a test. The way it's
yeah,
supposed to
George,
be medically.
you remember the way your reports used to work in PCC. So we would group them by default. All right, it was like well visits, sick visits, consults, hospitals. We actually had to break out during COVID because this tidal wave of visits came in that needed recategorization. We had to break out telemedicine visits because before COVID they were 0.3% and they got as high as
Yeah.
20%. And then we had to break out COVID, what we call COVID visits. And yeah, we still get a fair amount of those. And of course, we have clients who never did anything. We have a ton of clients who never gave COVID vaccine. And then we have clients who gave out 6 figures worth of COVID vaccine, the units, not dollars. And so the variance is significant. But yeah, the most important thing, I mean, you know this, when you're doing benchmarks is to continue to measure against yourself and people who are measured the same way. That's the important thing.
Okay. And now I bring this up because I'm going to get back on topic. We figured that a well-run practice is about 5% no-shows in any given
Mhm,
day.
mhm,
And that has an impact on your revenue. If you can
mhm.
make sure that 5% showed up, you'd be better off.
Well, I think it's generally true that if you actually know who's going to come in, your life is a little bit easier. 5%, one kid a day. Some practices, believe it or not, I've even been told this straight up. Some practices actually like having a certain no-show volume because it gives them flexibility within their schedule. I think that's a little crazy, but I have heard that. But 5% or less to me isn't a problem. When the problem becomes when you approach, 10% or higher, and even when you correct for the primary variables that affect your no-show rate. If your no-show rate approaches a certain percentage, I don't know what that magic number is, your practice becomes too chaotic and it leads to actually most people think right away, oh, if my no-show rate's 20%, that means I have a lot of gaps in my schedule. And in fact, the opposite is often true. If someone has a no-show rate of 20%, what they often have is too many people crammed into it as a result. They know the no-show rate is 20%, so they overbook by 30%. And when it just so happens that 8 people actually show up at 11 o'clock, you're working through lunch. And it's bad for them and it's bad for you. That's the real problem with no-shows is not that you are seeing fewer patients, it's that you can't predict your schedule, and so you sometimes have too many and you sometimes have too few. The patient volume in our clients with high no-show rates is higher than it is with the ones with low no-show rates.
But I think that
It's not a
that
matter that I hope that
I
makes
think
sense.
that model where everybody's booked at 1 o'clock and everybody shows up and then they'll see him for the rest of their day. That's a model of like back in the day, Herb, remember the clinics,
Yes.
hospital
Yeah.
clinics? Everybody gets booked at 1 o'clock. Everybody shows up around the same time. Half of them don't show, and then you have a full day. I don't think private practices actually do that model. I don't think so.
Oh,
I've
there
never seen that.
absolutely some would do that. Yeah, I don't encourage it. No, I don't encourage it at all. But obviously, some practices that may not be well run, some practices that are super high Medicaid, so they're acting like a clinic anyway. I am a very big believer that pediatric practices need to focus on preventive care. Preventive care is the heartbeat of your practice. And you can't focus on preventive care if you can't schedule it in advance. All right. That's like the whole purpose is that you have a schedule, you have a calendar, and we need to do these things on a schedule. It's not on demand, it's projected. And so those practices but there's one big exception. I want to talk about an exception in a second, but those practices who have a lot of scheduling chaos don't generally have great well visit coverage rates. They don't.
What are your
One big
thoughts?
exception is this. There is one big exception, and I've seen this work incredibly well, are those practices who do an early morning walk-in clinic.
Mhm.
So I know some practices who are like very, very successful and accomplished pediatric practices with a high focus on preventive care. What they say is from 7 to 8 a.m., you just walk in, don't call, show up, and they'll crank through, a pile of kids in an hour because those 7 or 8 a.m. things are, and they tell people this is for a fast acute visit. All right. This isn't for your 3 months of headaches. This isn't for your eating disorder. This isn't for a well visit. But if you are sick, show up. If it's an ear thing, a throat thing, a rash, whatever, show up and they bang, bang, bang. And you pull all of those 5-10 minute visits out of the schedule early in the morning, keeping people happy. That gives you time to spread out a little bit in the later day. I have seen that done very successfully.
We hope you're enjoying this episode. As you know, George and I are passionate about independent community pediatrics. We honestly believe this is the best care for children across the U.S. George and I say this time and time again, that chances are high your vaccine program is not as effective as you think. After factoring in time, waste, fees, and the many other costs many practices barely break even. That's where Canid comes in. They do everything from buying the vaccines to managing all the paperwork to making sure you get paid fairly for both private and VFC vaccines. You simply scan the vaccine and you're done. We partner with them to offer you a free lunch where they'll help you understand the financials of your vaccine program in more depth. Just go to canid.io/lounge to learn more. That's canid.io/lounge, or look for the link on the show notes.
Did you ever hear of any practice that did same day well visits? What are your thoughts?
Well, you all do to some extent, right?
Okay.
You know, like there's that mom who calls and says, "Oh my God, I am sure that we have practices who have experimented with all on-demand scheduling, and obviously, practices who are in growth mode do that. You know, the phone rings, you say, "Come in," and you're not actually filtering any visits. They'll do more of those, but an established practice, as a rule, has usually a couple week wait. You can't just waltz in today and get a well visit unless there's some,
Right.
extraneous circumstance that's
So,
driving.
from a money perspective, if you lose 10% of your visits, in say, I know it's a little less than that, but an average pediatrician makes 5,000 visits a year, right? That's what they see. 4,000.
Fewer than that. It's actually fewer than that, but
What do you think? Like
use
4,000?
5,000. It's easy to multiply.
And
These
so,
days, 3,500. Just so you know, 3,500
okay.
is the cutoff. Right.
But if you do that 5,000 times 10%, that's times $155. That's $77,000 per doctor that you have that went
Yeah.
out. So,
But
it's going to vary on your payer mix and how many patients this doc sees versus that other doctor. But it's not $50.
no.
77,000 is almost half of what the average pediatrician makes in America, 180,000. So, it's a significant amount of revenue loss. So what did you find out when you dug deep into this?
All right.
Who is likely not to show up?
So a couple things. First of all, there are a bunch of vendors out in the market who sell no-show solutions. All right. I've
Mhm.
tried working with a couple. I've yet to find anyone who really certainly can manage it in peds. And one of the first premise you have to address is that a 10% no-show rate means, in fact, you can increase your patient volume by 10%, that you've actually lost 10% of your visits. Because in reality, you haven't. You've overbooked your practice in order to have the volume that makes you get to where you want to be. I mean, that's just how it works. It's you're reducing chaos and you're creating predictability when you fix your no-show problem. You're not, it's in pediatrics at least, you're not staring at empty slots as a rule. What we discovered though, we discovered a couple things. We did discover, in fact, that obviously, this was no surprise, people without insurance and people with Medicaid have a much higher no-show rate. That's a fact. We can attribute that to all kinds of things, not the least of which is challenges that that population have with work and transportation. But if we isolate for Medicaid and lack of insurance, and by the way, we did all of this before COVID, and as a result of the COVID emergency measures and so forth, the Medicaid population has changed quite a bit. It'd be really interesting to review that data post COVID to see what the implication is. But what we then looked at was, all right, if we isolate lack of insurance, if we isolate for Medicaid, what other markers are there? And the single biggest marker, this is going to sound really stupid, all right, like obvious. But to me, it was a revelation because this should change the way that everyone schedules. The single biggest predictor of somebody no-showing is whether they no-showed last time. And so it's like massively. I mean, this was years ago, but I actually, George, I think you even responded to my blog post at the time. It was like, it's like the 80-20 rule, but it's really like 90-10. It's about 10% of your patients make up like 60 or 70% of your no-shows. It's a very
Correct.
small part of your population. It's a very small part of your Medicaid population who does this. And so the over-under was that as soon as a family is no-shows more than 10% of the time, which you're like, what does that even mean? It means if you have a family who is not no-showed with 3 kids, and by the way, it's based on the family, not just the one kid. You have to look at all the kids on that family. But if you have a family with 3 kids and they have shown up for all their visits for years and they had a no-show, that's not a good predictor of the next no-show. But if you have a family who no-showed at their 2nd visit or at their 4th visit, you need to put them on the high flyer or the low flyer list. As soon as a family no-shows, usually it's like more than once, but it's like no-shows for 10% or more, 9% technically, but 10% or more of their visits, then you should mark them and you should check with them leading up to the appointment in person. And what I mean by that is everyone here has reminder tools, okay? Everyone here like has automated tools that text your patients and give you text reminders, and that works it helps a little bit. But every day you should look at your schedule. And if you have, all right, let's say you're a 5-doctor practice, so you have 200 kids coming in today. Just making that, oh no, 200 kids, that'd be way too many. Let's say you have 100 kids coming in today, 110 kids coming in today. If you have 10% of those families are the no-showers, your staff makes 10 phone calls in the morning. It's as simple as that. That will do more for your no-show rate than anything else. You know the 10 families. The odds of those other families not showing have everything to do with things those families don't know yet. Something happened at work. Their car got a flat. They
overslept. They overslept.
Yeah, well, you two guys right now, you guys don't no-show for doctor's appointments. But if you had a doctor appointment at 4:00 today, there are many things that could happen to each one of us before 4:00 that would cause us to no-show. There's nothing anyone can do about it. And these people don't want to no-show. But if George Rogu is someone who no-shows half the time, or let's just say he's no-showed twice already, you should call him this morning and get him on the phone. And you can make rules for those people. You can say, you have now no-showed twice, 3 times. You do not get to make appointments. You are same day only.
Oh, I love that. So if you know this is a high-risk patient, they call and say, I want to see you. Because that's the other thing you found out. You're more likely
Yes,
to not show if the appointment is scheduled 3 days in advance or more. So
correct. No-shows almost never occur for same-day appointments.
So if this is a patient family that chronically no-shows and they want an appointment for 3 days, you go, we'll call you, whatever. Today's Tuesday. We'll call you on Friday morning, tell you what appointment's available. See if it works.
Yep. And if your kid is sick, you call us that day. We'll figure out how to get you in. Because for one kid, you can make that. You do that for one kid. All right. And it's a Medicaid kid. Yeah.
The tricky part there is, and we had this conversation before, what do you do with these families to get the well child exam done?
That is, you're absolutely right. That's super tricky. And that's where I have a couple suggestions. One of them is, right, if you have a 10% no-show rate, which is where you're really starting to struggle with managing your no-shows, all right? Rather than overbook all of your families indiscriminately. So all right, so if you have 10% no-show and you want to see 20 kids in a day, what a lot of people do is they book 25 kids, knowing they will overbook 5 of those slots, knowing that somewhere between 0 and 5 people will no-show today. All right, on average. And so what that means, every now and then they see 20, every now and then they see 25, but most of the time they see 22.5, and it kind of works out. However, when you overbook those 5 slots, you're doing it like at 9 and 10:30 and 12 or whatever. Well, what happens if the overbooked slot you get, everyone shows up? Why not overbook only with the people who no-show the most? Why not put all of your high no-show people at the time, at the least desirable time of day? Give your people who want that early appointment or whatever the case may be. I don't know what the demand is in your office. Why not give the people who show up, you give them the best times, and then you overbook your no-showers for the same slot, because then it's most likely not to crash your system.
Right? How about putting them on a wait list and, for the well child? Like I know you
Absolutely, that is
you have
absolutely
I don't know when your birthday
perfectly
is, but
reasonable
let's
thing
say
to
it's
do. Yep,
in May. I'll put you on a wait list for May for your physical. And
yep,
then I'll call you every week and say, "Hey, Chip, we got physicals tomorrow. We want to come in, or how about if you
yep,
come in on Thursday?" And I keep
yep.
calling
That,
you all
that's
month long.
Yep, that is the kind of planning that a pediatric practice has to do in order to generate revenue while making their community healthier. That is the hustle. That's your hustle. You just described it. What you just described is what every practice should be doing, in my opinion.
Okay, all right, because I've seen it both ways. I help a clinic out that is 85% Medicaid near Quantico Marine Base, right? And
Yeah.
they overbook. They don't count for no shows. They just delete them from the schedule. But everybody that you
Oh,
see,
I wouldn't do
well,
that, but
I understand, but everybody that you see when you look in EC worthless, I can say that because I'm a pediatrician.
Yep.
They have their next well child appointment already scheduled. It gets done. They come in for a sore throat, gets done in the front desk. They come in for a sprained ankle, it gets done in the front desk. They come in for their 2-year-old well child exam, they've already scheduled them for 365 days from today, and they have all the reminders and they have no shows, but she's tremendously busy, you know. I agree with
I
you.
advocate.
Count them. I count them.
Yep,
See how you can do that. Maybe you could get another doctor. You could get 2 days off, instead of having to work 5 days a week, whatever.
yep,
But that system does work even in a high Medicaid population.
yep.
So, and that's what
I
you
I will tell you,
advocate.
we have practices. We've had many practices over the years with very high 60, 70, 80% Medicaid populations who
Mhm.
do extremely well with well visit coverage, HPV vaccination, all the markers, all the things that some doctors tell me, well, you can't get the Medicaid kids in. You can. You can if you build your practice around it. You can if you build expectations. Are you going to bat 1,000? Of course you won't. But just like we know that the level of HPV vaccination in a practice is wholly dependent on the physician attitude, not the population. I mean, like, I've had too many people tell me, "Oh, you don't understand my patients." And I'm like, I got someone on the other side of town who has the same patient base as you do, who does twice as many HPV shots. And that's because they care about it, because they believe in it, and because they actually promote it. You just haven't fought about
Embraced
it.
it.
You j- and the same thing is true of getting your Medicaid kids in. So, Herb, I agree wholly. You should treat your Medicaid families like the adults they are and get their well visits booked. And you do your hustle to get them in. Everyone's a little bit different. There's a balance, but I am also a fan of what you described.
So, to succeed, you need to have good tech because, you need to be able to figure out what you're scheduling. You need to have good people and you need to have a process in place. That process may vary depending on, how you want to skin the cat, you
Yep.
know. You
And yeah, but just skin the cat. Don't give up.
right,
Don't don't
right.
don't tell me you can't do anything about it,
Have
because
a
you can.
process and check
Yeah,
on the process. Because if you don't check on the
absolutely.
process, then, yeah, I mean, if you just tell the staff schedule everybody for the well and you never look if they're doing it, they'll
Right. And you never look at what your coverage rates are. You never look at what your no-show rates are for those visits. You never look at how many times you've called them and whether you made contact. The big lesson is, no matter what I say right now or whatever you two guys say, doesn't matter as much as the fact that you're actually working on doing something to improve your no-show rates in your practice. Everyone's different. And someone listening might have a cool idea that we haven't tried or we haven't mentioned. Nothing wrong with that. Awesome. Just do something. Don't tell me it can't be done, because it's done all the time.
All right. And then this wasn't on the topic, but vaccines are important to some practices, greater to some practices than other practices, depending on the state you are. So when we're just talking about vaccine serum, overall, what is it? What is a good margin?
So that's a good question. I mean, the AAP's white paper and research on this is good. I have no reason to disagree with it at all. I think you really want to shoot for 17 to 25% or 28%. So, of
Okay.
of margin over your over what you paid. As a rule of thumb, I use 25%. Now, I know a lot of people who don't get anywhere close to 25%. And one element of the discussion, I don't think I don't want to say well understood, but it's weird to me how people don't think about it this way. I feel like I'm bucking the trend a little bit, or I'm sailing into the wind a little bit on this, and I don't get it. And I'm waiting for someone to educate me. But the bottom line is, you can't give the vaccine without the admin. So you can't do an analysis of a true full analysis of your vaccine profitability without including the admins. And the
Okay.
fact is, all right, this is not universally true. This is just generally true. The fact is, for whatever reason, the payers pay a decent profit on the administration most of the time, not all the time. Plenty of greedy, evil examples, but on average, right? With payers paying, I can look up what our numbers are right now, but payers pay about 20, 25 bucks on average for a 90460, and they pay 10 to 15 bucks for a 90461. All right, you
Mhm.
give that MMR, and if you're breaking even on the MMR product, but you get 20 bucks plus 12 plus 12, okay, it didn't cost you 35 bucks to administer that vaccine from beginning to end. It didn't. All right. If you combine the profit of the admin with the profit or not of the
Sure.
product, you will, generally speaking, I think pediatricians fare well. Of course, your mileage may vary. Like, I know practices who get screwed by this stuff, but I know practices for whom vaccine business is, without it, they would be in big trouble. I don't like to really dwell on, frankly, I don't like to dwell on vaccine profitability too much, because I think it plays into the hands of the people who are anti-vaccine. They believe that pediatricians give the vaccines because they make money on them. We know that they give vaccines regardless of what they're being paid. No pediatrician I know has a kid in front of them and says, "No, I'm not vaccinating you." Like, I've never seen that once in my whole career. They vaccinate like they breathe because you all believe in it, and that's the way it should be.
So
However, for
yes.
us as a society to depend on you to eat the costs of vaccination,
Yeah, it can't be done.
I'm not having that. I'm not having so
No.
you
But,
should be making money.
to your point, so I break it down by I call them revenue centers. So there's a revenue
Yep,
center that's your
yep,
lab. There's a revenue center that's your vaccine serum. There's a revenue center that is your vaccine administration. There's a revenue center that's your sick visits. And there's a revenue center that's your well visits. And then there's a no revenue center, which is all the screening that we do that barely gets paid for. And if you're just looking at the vaccine serum, the true number on margins is somewhere between 6 to 12%. I don't care who you tell me you're buying the vaccine product from.
all the GPOs are very close to each other.
And when I
And
look at the data and I look from one practice to the practice, I can't do this on screen, but you know what I want to do with my middle finger.
yep,
Okay.
yes.
The problem here, which is a tricky part when we're working with one of Georgia's medical students doing data analytics, is that people think that if they just take, we all know what you have to pay for a varicella vaccine, 250 bucks. That's the CD says that's what the commercial value of it is. And you
Yep.
say, well, it's costing me 250 and I'm getting paid 275. So the margin's $25. Wait, let me tell you something. On a $250 or 300 vaccine, if you miss 10 that weren't reimbursed, you're losing money. You cannot
Yeah.
just say, oh, this cost me this and this insurance pays me that. My margin's 25 bucks. You don't know that's your margin until you got that money back in your pocket. So you really have to dig deep to get into whether you're losing money. And a lot of times losing money simply because their revenue cycle management sucks and they didn't get paid for the
Yeah,
things they gave.
I wholly agree. I don't know if you've seen it on my blog, but I built a little IMS analysis tool specifically to do this work. And one of the things I learned, all right, I used to really be into going through the costs of the different elements, because the part that people don't understand that when you're talking about vaccine product profitability, okay, you have the expense of getting the vaccine into the fridge, and then you have the expense of getting from the fridge into the kid. The fridge into the kid is the admin part, but all the work that you have to do to get that vaccine into the fridge, the time spent talking to the GPOs and figuring out which one you want, the time spent ordering, inventory management, the losses from dropped or broken vaccines or ordered vaccines that can't be given or unpaid vaccines or, I actually have compiled a long list. That expense is often overlooked. I'm surprised actually that you're seeing numbers between 6 and 12%. I think I have plenty of clients for whom that number is closer to zero or even negative because of the expenses that are related. And I think it's made worse. I don't think it's made worse. I know it's made worse when you have a practice that does VFC and private stock, because you have additional overhead you have an additional refrigerator often, all right? Or, you certainly are managing stuff differently. You have 2 sets of inventories. You are getting audited. Because the VFC program is punitive more than supportive as a rule. I think there are 2 or 3. I agree with you that looking at these different cost centers is a really important way to look at it. Personally, I combine the admin and the product because you can't do one without the other. It's not possible, so I combine them. However, the broad cost center of vaccines in pediatrics is still not really fundamentally understood in our business. Independent practices deliver the overwhelming majority of vaccines in this country, yet no one really quite understands what the chain is, the financial chain of that. It's
You
not.
would think after the COVID thing, we should know how the financial chain goes. When it comes to like negotiating a contract, every company
Yep.
uses different formula to determine the value of the vaccine serum. What do you think is the best
Yeah.
one?
I think the only one that matters is the CDC public sector price because it's the closest to what you pay. All
That's
this
the
other.
one that they don't use.
Yeah, do you think that's coincidence? Of course you don't. I mean, it's BS, all right? Like, that's exactly what's going. They use the AWP and the Red Book and all this stuff that's hard to find. That is just conscious obfuscation. That people over on the insurance side are not idiots. And it's all a slow down and let's make this a little bit hard. It doesn't, and that's where, this, you look at what they are offering for payments on the vaccine, even if they're using some weird AWP thing, you say, but still give me your number. You look at their present numbers, you look at what you get paid for the admins, and you calculate that way. And more broadly, you back up and say, what is my average revenue going to be for this payer? Because they play a shell game. They move some money from here to here. In a way, I don't care if they don't want to pay me for an MMR at all. If they want to pay me $0 for an MMR, I'll accept that. If they're paying me $210 for that well visit code, or
Right.
like it all,
Right.
you really have to look at the big payment picture. As people want to zoom in. I'm getting screwed by Blue Cross because they don't pay me for X. You probably are, but maybe they're doing well on the other side, and it's really another payer who's just generally lower on everything. Oh yeah, because I remember this, George. You and I have actually had this talk way in the good old days. Well, when the payers would come along and say, "I'll pay you for that 99051. I'll pay you $10 for that after hours code." And people get excited and they chase it and sign that contract. And I'd be like, all they had to do is take $1 off of every one of those E&Ms and you just lost money. And
Right.
so you really got to you really have to do all the math all the time.
And you got
No way to
to
avoid.
concentrate on your bigger revenue centers. And that's where you're
Yes.
going to your negotiation. The other one really, the other stuff becomes Yeah, okay, it's icing the cake, but I've already had the cake. Anyhow, so just to recap here, it doesn't matter what GPO you're using, you're probably not going to get more than $1 here or there on the vaccines. You should
Yeah,
be
I don't. Yep,
you should be measuring, you know, what your vaccine serum profitability is with or without the admin fees, just so that you have, and then you have to break it down by commercial and Medicaid, because obviously you're not paying for the product on the Medicaid side.
correct. And generally speaking, Suzanne Madden did some really deep research on this. And 10 years ago, it cost. She could tell you what she came up with, but the Arizona chapter came up with a number. It was like $11 per administration. That's what it cost in an analysis that they did. And I'm going to guess right now, with wages where they are and the additional overhead of giving vaccines than even 10 years ago. I think it's between 15 and $20 to give an administration. That's what you're paying staff largely. Of course, that varies massively with how you delegate your vaccine work. But let's say it's $15. Let's say it's $18 per vaccine. Well, there are some times you give a flu shot, you'll be lucky to get $18 for your ad. You give a Pentacell, you're going to get quite a bit more than that. All right. And so it's you have to look at what your broad, across the board, average your stuff, because it's not like as pediatricians, you're going to be in the business of giving profitable vaccine lines. Oh, I only give the Pentacell and the whatever, the Tdap. I'm making it up. I don't
Yep.
give MMR. I don't, because I
No,
lose money on it. That's not that. No
it,
one
it
does that.
it's a bizarre business concept. Well, no, it's not really. Vaccines for a pediatric office are loss leaders. We do it because it's the right thing to do. We just hope not to lose 50 or 100 grand a year vaccinating kids. That's really bottom line. It's just about
Yep.
minimizing the loss. We make more money from the sick visits, as a profit center because there are more of them and they're
Yep.
quicker. But we do the vaccines because it's the right thing to do. We just have to make sure that we are not losing 50, 100 grand, per provider vaccinating, because that's not sustainable. And
No, it's not.
that's
And
why it's
and
something we would look at.
I don't clearly during COVID. All right, COVID was a cash grab for pharma and for the insurance companies. All right, the COVID vaccine comes out, and you didn't have to pay for the product, but you would get $35 to give it. All right.
40.
Now the implication is, oh, well, that's $35 profit every time I give it. No, 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 no. Because man, trying to figure out how you were even going to get paid. All right. Figuring out how to store it, having to deal with, having to deal, as some of our clients did, how to deal with protesters out in front of your office, how to
Right.
deal with families who left your practice because you're giving the vaccine, how to answer hours, not just hours, weeks of questions for all your families. There wasn't enough money to do that. Like, that's not enough. Like, so on one hand, in some of my clients' bank accounts, there's decent amount of money for giving those COVID vaccines, but no one did it for the money. No one did it for the
No,
money. You would
and, and
never
not
have done it for the money. It's
and not
not
to
worth
speak
it for the
of
money.
that we didn't really know the answers.
Right.
Talk about scientific method. We were just flying by the seat of our pants. Like, should I vaccinate my kid? I don't know. I think you should, but I don't know. I mean, I don't. Vaccines take 20 years to develop. This was developed in 9 months. There's tons of studies on safety and what happens to your immunity 5 years, 10 years after you got the vaccine. We have 9 months and little tiny studies. And I'm supposed to extrapolate what's going to happen to your 1-year-old once I give the vaccine when he's 25. I don't know. No one really knows. We're guessing it's going to be great, and it will be great. It's a safe vaccine. But, it was a very stressful for parents and pediatricians who were actually trying to make the best choice for their kid to keep them safe and not do harm. It wasn't an easy shot.
Yeah.
No,
Not like HPV. I can tell you, I tell people, you're a fool if you don't take the HPV. It's a miracle. There's been 2 miracles: hepatitis B, HPV. 2 cancer preventing vaccines. They're working on the third one in Boston for preventing breast cancer. And you're going to walk away from that miracle? You're dumb.
I read a piece in Scientific American, I can't remember, where there are 3 or 4 dozen mRNA cancer vaccines in trial right now.
Yeah.
All right.
3
And
of
that is
them in
going to
Boston
be a game changer.
for breast
Game
cancer.
changers.
Imagine that day where I can vaccinate a little girl and say, you ain't going to have chemotherapy ever in your darn life.
Pediatricians are the only specialty that actually fight cancer. Everyone else depends on it to stay in business.
That's right.
Period. All right. If pediatricians, if our side of this fence starts giving vaccines that eliminate cancer, the hospitals are going to freak out.
They're already freaking out.
All right. Well, it means, all right, imagine you're the bean counter up at the hospital. All right. Doesn't matter if you're for profit or not, because that for-profit, non-profit designation is all BS as well. Yeah. You're at the bean counter up at the hospital, and all of a sudden you realize these pediatricians are giving vaccines that are going to eliminate breast cancer. You know, right now you have a ticking time bomb 20 years from now.
Yeah.
All right. And if some of these vaccines come out and can be given to adults, all right,
about that.
This is going to prevent carcinoma. This is going to prevent, I mean, there's a zillion cancers under the sun. Every one of them that we can prevent at any point is going to subtract billions of dollars from the healthcare industry.
Yes.
And pediatricians are the only ones who are like, la, 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 I'm giving the shot because it's the right thing to do. Everyone else depends on that revenue. And
that's right.
It pits you against everyone else. So yeah. And by the way, that was my segue, Herb, into your other topics.
Oh, all right.
I think you can build a bridge to the other topic.